Just fork it. Does Bitcoin need a soft fork? We'll be going over a few definitions. Some of this actually, unfortunately, was probably already covered in the last one, but I didn't collaborate with Steve, but more learning. So basically kind of the overview of today is going to be like the types of soft forks I kind of categorize them to be, and then you have the features, security, and improvements. Some history about soft forks, and then kind of like my kind of overview that I categorize these as in terms of like the good, which I would consider the needs for Bitcoin, the meh, which would be nice to have, and then I did do the nope for now at least category, and then wrapping all of it up with a nice little conclusion. So in terms of the types of soft forks, there are security soft forks that exist in Bitcoin. So that is basically any soft fork that ensures the Bitcoin network operates continuously without adverse events. Probably my favorite example of this is BIP30 and BIP34. So what happened is early in Bitcoin's history, they figured out that if you used the same Coinbase address and everything, you would end up with a duplicate TXID. Peter Woolley originally fixed this with BIP30, then BIP34 finally put this to rest for good by including the Coinbase height in the script sig, which means every Coinbase transaction has to be different. We won't have the same TXIDs. There are also other things like coinflation bugs, 2017, that have been patched with soft forks. The activation method of those we'll go over later. Features. I would consider this anything that enables something brand new into Bitcoin that hasn't existed before. Taproot would be a good example of that. SegWit as well. And then improvements. These are anything that enhances an existing feature on the Bitcoin network. So notes about this. The most contentious soft forks have historically been feature activations. So anytime you're adding new functionality to Bitcoin, that is because along with being technically right in the actual code and implementation, you have to be socially right as well, ensuring that this doesn't create adverse social consequences that prop up later, or just in general, change the behavior of the incentives in Bitcoin. So technical improvements on Bitcoin, like, for example, a security patch, right? BIP30, BIP34, you really only have to get the technical component right. There are some adverse effects, like, you use a little bit of that script sig space that's very valuable for those extra bytes to put in the height, but it's a pretty easy trade-off. So security and network operation, I joke, but nobody really seems to talk about this stuff that much because it's boring, though it's actually the most important part of Bitcoin are these kind of soft forks specifically. I think they should be more thoroughly reviewed and discussed. So basically, like, what even are soft forks? So basically, most feature-based soft forks, which are the ones that are more contentious, you have the set of rules of things that are Bitcoin, like consensus rules. And soft forks, basically the add features create like this little carve out that says anybody can spend on the old nodes, and we'll protect these rules with new nodes that enforce these rules. So as the miners and the economic actors on the network upgrade their nodes, they'll enforce to make sure that those don't actually become anybody can spends, because the miners won't validate it if you don't enforce the green box of rules. Old nodes, if they were mining on them, would enforce all the rules, but if they mined on that, they would break those rules, and 50+% of the hash rate would likely orphan their block. So with the note about that, there are soft forks in Bitcoin that can exist that don't require consensus from the economic actors on the network. That is basically block template construction, censorship, right? So if suddenly Bitcoin miners soft fork into something that, for example, may take away the ability to spend from Satoshi's coins in the event of like a quantum attack on Bitcoin, right? They say, we're just going to not allow pay-to-pub key addresses to be spent. That'd be a soft fork. Economic actors on the node, on the network, would have no ability to stop something like that. So that's why I say that enforced by nodes and miners most of the time. So most soft forks we've had today have all been basically unilaterally accepted by node runners and miners. So changes to Bitcoin. So early Bitcoin was absolutely full of soft forks. Like, things were changing quite frequently, and they were adding new features quite often. And between basically up until 2017, there were 5 soft forks that existed. Then the block size wars happened, and there's only been one soft fork activation since. So the question is, like, has Bitcoin ossified? Have the devs just lost their mojo? I don't necessarily agree with the latter, but yeah, ossification is a thing, and basically every protocol as it gets bigger, from USB to Bitcoin. These changes do have to go through various activation methods, typically, if it's not categorized as like an emergency activation. So you'll have like miner activated soft forks, which are basically the miner signal that we're going to do something. Economic actors on the network then adopt it. User activated soft forks are users will activate a soft fork. This has not happened. And they will say that, hey, if a miner mines a block that doesn't follow our rules, we'll get rid of it. The QSIF, which is basically a secondary program that runs alongside your Bitcoin core node, will activate a specific condition. For example, you can activate opcat on your node today using QSIF. We basically run a little external program that validates the block that comes in and says, okay, this is good for my node. But what happens is, if it's not an opcat block, it will literally just say invalidate block with hash, and then you'll find your own chain. Speedy Trial was kind of like a special version of miner activated soft fork for Taproot. And then the last is like my favorite, the emergency activation. This was the majority of soft forks we've had so far. They basically, with an emergency activation, there isn't a formal activation method like, okay, the miner is going to flag, users are going to flag, or some other method like that. Bitcoin Core maintainers just put in the code into Bitcoin Core and then release it. So they just, as people upgrade their nodes, they will adopt this, soft fork. Examples of that have been like, Coinflation bug again in 2017. And there are a few others listed in the link above, but can't click that. So the other thing about soft forks is in Bitcoin, they do have unintended consequences sometimes. The combination of SegWit enabling the discount on bytes and subsequent Taproot upgrade, removing the witness size cap for script, kind of created a caste system for data in Bitcoin, where you could essentially, if you were doing monetary transactions on the network, moving from inputs to outputs, creating UTXOs, you're getting the markup of 4x versus arbitrary data storage or making Bitcoin your data layer. You can get basically a quarter of the price for the number of the bytes. So overall, that was, I don't think, something that was thought about during the activation of SegWit. Taproot, it was mentioned that this restriction being lifted could cause people to store data on Bitcoin. At the end of the day, though, I don't think anybody had the idea that it would create kind of this entire ecosystem around specifically inscriptions and ordinals and Bitcoin becoming a JPEG data layer currently. So back to the original question, does Bitcoin need a soft fork? To make this question easy to answer, I'm going to constrain it. So the definition for need here is required to function and fulfill the use case of Bitcoin outlined in the white paper. So a purely peer-to-peer version of electronic cash that would allow online payments to be sent directly from one party to another without going through a financial institution. That's a need. So let's talk about soft forks real quick and kind of like the development. If you ask any Bitcoin hodler what they'd ask of the devs to do for Bitcoin, what would they ask? What do hodlers ask of the devs? NGU. Yeah, literally just please don't break Bitcoin for me. Like just NGU. Yeah, and literally next slide. It's going up forever, Laura. Just don't break Bitcoin. So sorry to say, that's the number one force. So we're talking about soft forks. What about an ideal soft fork? What would happen? Consensus would literally be perfect. Everybody would immediately just adopt this. Node runners, miners. It would scale Bitcoin. All 8 billion people can transact as frequently as they would like. No security trade-offs. The soft fork, anything you want, it wouldn't break Bitcoin. Centralizing forces, it wouldn't have any centralizing forces. It wouldn't give the miners an advantage. It wouldn't threaten the validation cost of the Bitcoin network. No negative interactions. So this means that you could implement this perfect soft fork without having any impact on future soft forks, if it even was needed anymore. Bitcoin at this point would have everything, right? And then stable long-term. The initial use case of the soft fork always maintains the most economically incentivized use case and doesn't shift or change over time with additional features or soft forks. So what I mean by that is basically kind of the SegWit example, that the initial kind of idea that SegWit would be used for basically increasing TPS and creating a discount for block space, or increase, not a mandatory block size increase, but it kind of was for miners. But at the end of the day, it enabled more transactions on Bitcoin. Would maintain true for the entirety of it. It did do that, but SegWit also became the precursor to basically data storage on Bitcoin. So there's one soft fork I think there's absolutely a need for Bitcoin. That would be the Great Consensus Cleanup. So the preface, though I break this up into like, do we need a soft fork? Yes. The problem, Bitcoin's consensus rules can enable behavior that can cause irreparable damage to the heaviest chain. Relay policy is literally the current guardian of the network to prevent this from happening. That is aside from the time warp attack. That is, you can't stop that with that. But currently, legacy Bitcoin script creates conditions during validation of script sig operations where you could string together a transaction and enough op check sigs or code separators in the right way, and you can create blocks that are incredibly difficult to validate. And if this block gets onto the network, and then you essentially end up with somebody mining on top of it, you can't really get rid of it. That's the thing about Bitcoin. It's immutable. And you would have that validation cost essentially until somebody wrote the assume valid that you wouldn't have to go back over that script again. So the little Raspberry Pis, the validation cost in the network temporarily increases. The other thing as well is the time warp mitigation in Bitcoin. So currently in Bitcoin, if miners get together, they can essentially move the difficulty down to a value of 1 in roughly 40 days. Why I think this is necessary is because I don't believe that Bitcoin is ready for a nation state adoption without the consensus cleanup. Like, it would be irresponsible just because of the fact that these would be too easily exploited by miners. An example is when Marathon released Slipstream as a product, one of the first emails I got was from some of you in this room saying, hey, please look into this stuff before you just dump this on the network. Marathon is 5% of the hash rate. That shouldn't be anything where individuals are emailing each other saying, hey, don't do this on the Bitcoin network. The fact that mining is so centralized is literally acting as like a service to the network to prevent individual miners or basically somebody from attacking the network deliberately because mining is decentralized. These miners, Antpool, F2Pool, Mara, create a very large swath of the hash rate. And all these miners, the pubcos, are incentivized not to do this to destroy the value of Bitcoin. Decentralized miners on the network have none of these constraints. They could broadcast these blocks. An example is like for Ocean's Datum that just came out. Datum enables miners or hash rate to create their own templates on site. They broadcast that block on site and they get credited through Ocean. That does not mean that that block, if they create a DOS block, won't end up on the network spinning the wheels of all the other miners that have to validate that until they decide to basically invalidate that block. So the Great Consensus Cleanup would mitigate this. There are some nuances to removing things. Opcode separator, for example, seems pretty easy that we would just take away opcode separator. Nobody's ever used this script in Bitcoin. But we did something called pay to script hash. And what that means is that we have hashes of scripts that can be redeemed. We don't know who has locked up their Bitcoin to this mysterious opcode separator, and nobody wants to permanently censor funds. So maybe somebody can come up with a nice little solution to that problem, and we can get rid of opcode separator and protect the production of blocks. Also, some other future good or needs for the Bitcoin network. We could use a soft fork for the timestamp bug. By 2106, we will have a solution to fix the fact that timestamps will roll over. A block can't be produced back to 1970 in the past. So with that said, I hope that doesn't have to be a hard fork, but at some point we got to deal with it. Quantum computing, that will be a need for a soft fork in the future. It is kind of the global warming of the Bitcoin ecosystem. It consistently gets news articles and ever closer, but still very far away. Pay to public key, pay to multisig, and pay to taproot addresses will not be secure to Shor's algorithm. As such, there will be quantum resistant address types. These will likely need a soft fork because of the fact that the signature size is much larger than what we currently use today. And definition of scaling, like ideally a need for a soft fork will occur because Bitcoin cannot handle 8 billion people on the network all competing for block space at the same time. There will have to be some way to share UTXOs, layer 2s, something with a unilateral exit. But as of right now, I don't even believe that's relevant at all. The mempool is currently full of uncommon goods and other ARB data at 2 sats of eByte. Transactions, you definitely can pay for them. do it on chain, and they'll get confirmed on average in about 10 minutes. We want it? Maybe. So the current most common topic are covenants. So this would be like op vault, CTV, APO, L enhance. Opcat is included in that, but I have another category for that. Optimization, cross-signature input aggregation. That one would be freaking amazing. Features, basically opcodes that have narrow scope, and I call them like the no clip from Half-Life 2. You could fly through all the walls and do everything. That would be Opcat and the GSR. So covenants specifically, these create spending conditions where users can lock up Bitcoin to specific spending conditions. And from my own opinion, they're pretty safe from a technical standpoint. And the social consequences of the like narrow scoped ones, in my own opinion, like CTV, are that you probably won't have negative externalities show up from them. Like people can use them to do ARB data on Bitcoin or swaps, etc. But I just don't feel it would increase the amount of flexibility enough to create super viable products or use cases, or kind of create the Ethereum environment in Bitcoin. Optimizations, soft forks like cross-input signature aggregation, I think would be really nice to have. That basically would be the condition where you could soft fork in. If you had a bunch of UTXOs that all went to the same address, you could sign for one of those inputs and then use the rest of those inputs without a signature attached to it. So that would reduce the size by roughly 72 bytes per input, giving more block space available, making more block space available to more transactions, or potentially increasing TPS. But that is a pretty narrow set of transactions that would apply to that. So Bitcoin's functionality can also be extended through the use of opcodes. So script elements that modify the stack. So new opcodes potentially that we could implement. We could do check sig from stack would be one that comes to mind. It's incredibly limited on its own, but when you combine it with, for example, Opcat, you can create incredibly powerful opcodes. So that's kind of my point about like it has to interact nicely with other opcodes as well, and not basically increase its own scope in the process of future upgrades. So though they're desirable, I would say not currently needed. Fee smoothing would likely be the best outcome because of that. So deep functionality soft forks. This would include Opcat and the Great Script Restoration. These soft forks enable very flexible opcodes, or sets of opcodes enable larger degree of unknowns than the narrow scoped opcodes or opcodes dedicated to covenants. These will enable unilateral exits on layer 2 solutions through rollups. These layer 2s could act as scaling solutions on Bitcoin, but you can also pretty much have any other functionality you'd like on the layer 2, because it's just the validation of the layer 2, whatever is determined by the peg out mechanism, that actually matters. So you can basically have other assets. You could even have space chains or whatever. You just dump money into them. They might not even return it. They could potentially enable Mevel through AMMs or DEXs, other opportunities. This in turn would enable miners with better templating capabilities to create MEV on Bitcoin. So furthering miner centralization, which we do not want. And adding these opcodes enables a tremendous amount of flexibility and functionality into Bitcoin to do both monetary transactions, but at the same time may end up perverting network incentive structures. And then the nope, in my own opinion. Sorry, Paul Storick. Again, my own opinion. Drive chains essentially are a method to create a hash rate escrow where miners control the outcome of pegouts on side chains. I think this, in the current state of Bitcoin, because of miner centralization, would perverse incentives a lot if the side chains obtained a high total value in them. And that is because at some point, it will make more sense for two miners to collude and take the funds in the drive chain and kind of show the facade that miners are somewhat decentralized. And then it becomes very apparent that miners will collude. And kind of the argument that I've heard for like why this is okay, because if they will collude to break a drive chain, Bitcoin is broken already anyways. I just don't think we need to put the incentive for them to do this there in the first place. And then also the value locked into drive chains could potentially, like it can exceed the total fee revenue of any of the side chains at some point. Like it's completely unbounded. So I don't know. I think it just creates pretty poor incentives. So like going into my conclusion here, like, right, this is what the Bitcoin network looks like as of this morning on mempool.space. You got 2 sats of eByte. Blocks are full of transactions, but it's mostly arbitrary data. So in the top right there, it's like I highlighted on mempool.space, anything that's kind of like a non-monetary use case of Bitcoin, going back to that original point of Bitcoin being money. And I just don't think that arbitrary data storage is a monetary use case. So need new stuff? No, I do not believe Bitcoin needs new feature-based soft forks today. Users have not arrived in droves. Demand for on-chain Bitcoin hasn't been taken away by secondary implementations that have these features. So we have like BSV, BCH, they have OPCAT currently. Bitcoin is not losing market share to these coins for that reason. Bitcoin needing hardening? Yes. The creation of Slipstream exposed to me directly that Bitcoin consensus flaws need to be dealt with sooner or later, especially before nation state adoption. Great consensus cleanup will solve some of those issues. And the future, Bitcoin will need a soft fork at some point. Community members, economic actors, and miners alike will form consensus when the incentives align. So closing that up, I just believe that ultimately, once the incentives align, people will literally be begging for the soft fork to happen. But currently, that is not happening because demand for block space has not created an environment that facilitates the need for a soft fork today. Question was about quantum computing and if we really do need to upgrade Bitcoin. Is that correct? Yeah. The answer to that is yes, 100%. Existing signature schemes have no capability of defending against a strong quantum computer. The initial signs of this would be you would see essentially Satoshi's pay-to-pub key addresses you'd see them getting mined by the quantum computer. So they basically break the discrete log problem again and again and again. That's not necessarily the worst case. It's once you can solve the discrete logs in under 10 minutes, that means you can take transactions in flight, solve for the signature, and redirect it to your own location for your wallet. So yes, if that becomes the case over enough time, and again, this is probably well beyond even 2106 after the timestamp bug, yeah, you could absolutely end up with a scenario where you have to soft fork into something that's resistant so that you can't have your transactions in flight be taken from you by some guy with a QC.
I'll project, Ricky. What do you see as the biggest barrier to these incentives aligning? And in your ideal world, what needs to be done for those incentives to align?
To create a soft fork?
Yeah. Well, to get consensus going in the right direction.
You have to have a need. Like there's got to be like some economic incentive for a soft fork to exist. And currently, you have a chicken and the egg problem. There are great promises from layer 2s like ARC, OPCAT that can create awesome things, but the market actors themselves don't want to break the existing system or don't want to change what already is working just fine. The only symptom we have currently of not having these soft forks is the lower fee revenue because of the lack of economic activity on Bitcoin. I do believe if you have some of these soft forks, you could earn more fee revenue as a miner and increase the security of Bitcoin. But the block subsidy kind of numbs most Bitcoin miners to that. Even Slipstream during debates about like, oh, wow, congratulations, you earned all this extra fee revenue through Slipstream. The block subsidy far outweighs any additional incentive it is to earn those fees.
Give us a scenario. Where do you see that fixing itself?
Once Blockspace is 200 sats of eByte, people, that's transactions $60. People will absolutely go, how do we make it possible to scale Bitcoin? And to do that right now, you need some sort of soft fork. But at 2 sats of eByte, I don't personally believe, in my own opinion, many people are going to go, we got to have this today. But also like soft forks, like fixing problems in Bitcoin, like the Great Consensus Cleanup does, that absolutely should be on everybody's mind and should be looked at today. The sooner you can solve this problem, the sooner you can get it over with and not have to worry about nation state adoption or some guy going, hey, you shouldn't adopt this. Like right now, there's a bunch of hash rate in China. If they really want to take advantage of your country that just adopted this brand new Bitcoin standard, they could just create a bunch of problematic blocks for you, fork you off the network, do all sorts of problematic things.
Gentleman in the white shirt, do you have a question?
Yeah, a question about a point about quantum. You're saying so since Google announcement of quantum supremacy in 2019, which has been since debunked, the consensus in the quantum space is that we're going to see real quantum supremacy by next year, and there has been a lot of push by quantum computer scientists that people should get ready. And one of them being Scott Aronson, which I'm sure you're familiar with.
I'm not deeply familiar with the actual implementations of quantum computing. I'm more familiar with just like the concept of that you have these pub keys on chain, and at some point they can be reversed into.
Oh, so I mean, you raised the point about it's become a prime when it's 10 minutes. No, it's become a prime because the second, imagine quantum computer here and can open Satoshi's keys, then it just can spend them.
That's an annoying problem though, that somebody's stealing Satoshi's coins. They'll get locked up to a quantum resistant algorithm after.
No, but it means first for the network, we have 20% of the whole network that all of a sudden belongs to someone that's not there anymore. Like all of a sudden we have a gigantic supply activation in some sense.
Yeah, but there's also, oh, you can go, sorry.
No. So that's one point. And second one is what I'm going for more like it's everyone quantum spacing, get ready. And the question is, how long before we become the frog that waited too long? It's the hardware. Right? The question is like, how do you get the activation before you already fried? That's the kind of question I'm at.
I don't know the answer to that one. I apologize.
Last question, and then if y'all have any more, I'll encourage you to take it upstairs on the 14th floor. We've got coffee and refreshments and stuff. So,
yeah, my question is about measuring demand. I think that, I strongly state that developers and even miners are not in a good position to measure financial demand. That is, people who aren't getting what they want from Bitcoin are getting sent to trusted custodians. They're getting sent to altcoins in some part, although none of them have taken over for possibly reasons other than real demand. And further, advanced custody is not, would be improved by these things. And there are financial products that are important for Bitcoin to become its fullest potential of a global reserve. And if we don't allow those products to be built with native Bitcoin tools, people are just going to be pushed elsewhere. So I submit that we don't have a good way to measure demand.
I would agree with that slightly. I think that, for example, though, like people taking custody of their UTXOs should be shown on chain, right? Like you should be seeing people actively bidding on Blockspace to move UTXOs. I'm not talking just like, hey, let's create some runes and op returns or some BRC20s, but actual like, hey, I want to send from Alice to Bob 1 Bitcoin to buy maybe a small motor vehicle or something. But the demand for even on-chain activity to me feels pretty low or weak. So yeah, I probably can't measure the exact demand, but I definitely feel the economic activity on the Bitcoin network that is people actually moving for goods and services does not feel even remotely kind of the same as what it did even in 2013, 2014, 2015, when there were more, I guess what I'm saying is like actual marketplaces seem to feel like it created more on-chain activity. And these fee spikes, yes, there was exchange activity, right? So people trading. There are also people using Bitcoin as money as defined in my original question. Do we need that soft fork? So yes, you're right. I can't measure demand accurately.
thank you, PortlandHODL. If you all have any more questions, again, I encourage you to ask me in the conference room upstairs.